Thank you very much, Siddharth. And thank you very much to Apollo Hospital and the entire team, Dr. Agnivesh, Dr. Siddharth Yadav, Dr. Ashish Pathak, Dar sir, and everyone who's involved in this venture. So, so today what I'm going to talk is from a residency point of view and basically from a early career also point of view as to when to do and when not to do. So in the polytrauma management, more of the easiest part is the orthopedic management. But the question is when to do which orthopedic management. That is a decision that needs to be taken because that has implications not only on the outcome of the patient, but also it saves a lot of headache for the surgeon himself and gives us more time to manage things well. So without wasting much time, we'll go to the slide show. So this is where I work. I work in Thane in Jupiter Hospital, and over the last years, what we have seen is being sort of a tertiary care center where a lot of facilities are available in our hospital, and we are strategically placed on the highway. We see a very large number of, as we call it, dirty trauma or polytraumatized patient who require multiple specialties to be involved and who require multiple intervention. So this slide has been played numerous times, but for the residents and for the people who don't know these slides, that we are interested in adverse outcomes or deaths following the polytrauma. So these was seen in the US in when they wrote the ATLS manual that there are certain deaths which occur immediately after a trauma. These are usually very highly devastating injuries like aortic aneurysm, aortic rupture, or massive chest trauma, or a massive head injury, or a transection of the cord, which leads to immediate death. Then there are certain deaths which are happening early, which is within like 1 hour to 24 hours after the trauma, which are because of shock, hypoxia. They could be because of head injury or because of some other reasons which are not in the really critical zone, but they all come together to sort of affect this patient. And then there are delayed causes of death. These delayed causes of death can be because of the secondary complications following polytrauma, which is like sepsis, or it could be the ARDS and the multi-organ failure. Now, when we start managing this patient, we should think that can we prevent these immediate deaths? These immediate deaths are occurring within the first hour, like an open pelvic injury or a massive crush injury. So these deaths can be prevented only by patient education, only by safety protocols, only by sort of driving safe, making sure you have the helmets, or making sure that the people and are educated at a mass level. But beyond this, there's not little that an orthopedic surgeon can do to decrease these deaths. So our target here is to prevent the second peak of death and definitely prevent the third peak of death. So these patients who sort of succumb to their injuries within hours or weeks after the polytrauma are what we are interested in saving them and in salvaging them. So let us start with defining polytrauma. So this was an article published in Injury a few years back in 2009, let's say 10 years ago, and where they have seen the different definitions of polytrauma, and there is a wide variety. I mean, people can define polytrauma by the number of injuries, the pattern or mechanism of injury, the consequent disability that the patient have. There are certain criterias. It could be based on the injury severity score plus the threat to life, and injury severity score plus the systemic inflammatory response syndrome. So in all, there is no consensus amongst surgeons who talk to each other about what is polytrauma. You could have two fractures and it is a polytrauma. You could have a fracture with a chest injury, that is a polytrauma. You could have a head injury with a sort of a wrist fracture, and that could also be labeled as a polytrauma. So all these cannot be bracketed into the same zone. So therefore, they proposed a classification. They said that there should be an injury to at least two body regions with a sort of an injury severity score of more than 3, the abbreviated injury severity score, because that is very easy to do, and with the presence of a systemic inflammatory response syndrome on at least 1 day during the first 72 hours. So when they say that there is a SIRS on at least 1 day during the first 72 hours, it means that these patients who have got more injuries have the potential to develop an SIRS even after the first 24 hours. And this is when there is a problem. The patient is with us, the patient is with an orthopedic surgeon, he is in a hospital, and then the patient starts deteriorating. So every one of us knows what are the implications socially and implications medically. And we are also worried about the social implications, that apart from the medical legal complications, there could be a lot of disgruntlement or disappointment amongst the patient's relatives, which could lead to a lot of unpleasantness also. So leaving those things apart, scientifically speaking, this is what polytrauma is. So if you have a patient who has got injury to two big body regions, like let's say a fractured shaft femur and a lung injury or a couple of rib fractures, and you think that he's not maintaining his saturations, and he gets an inflammatory response with sort of raised WBC count or low platelet counts or acidosis, at least within the first 24 to 48 hours, this basically could be bad news. So this is where you have to sort of be careful. So in the next half an hour or so, there will be only 3 or 4 very good take home points which you should remember at least till the time the next consensus or the next sort of fresh wave of knowledge comes to us. So that will help you guide your treatment very well. So I'm not going to go into the details of where to find these tests and bore you with the biochemical details, but I'm just going to tell you where you can find these readings, how you can implement into your day-to-day practice, and how you can remember it for reproducing it during the exams. So, the concept came from a from this the thought in 1960s that early definitive fixation may be considered as a standard of care in stable patients. Okay, so in big trauma centers where everything was available, let's say residents, the systems were there, operation theater, all the implants were there, you could offer the patient early definitive fixation, and therefore there was a lot of interest in early definitive fixation. So if you look at the chronology in the 1950s, we thought that the patient was too sick to operate on. And therefore, there were conservative treatments. Put the patient in a plaster, put the patient in a splint, and wait for the inflammation to go down. But then they thought, then they started fixing these fractures early, and then the reports of early benefits of early stabilization started to come in. And then they said that if you get the patient out of the bed very early, then the patient gets benefit. It leads to a better outcome, and the problems of bedriddenness, they are all sort of sorted. In the 1980s, as knowledge started increasing, as we started sort of operating on more and more patients, this gentleman Bone, this is from again from Americas, they said that this benefits of early stabilization was established. It was firmly established, and that was said to be the standard of care. And these patients were thought of, they are too sick not to operate on. So even if a patient is badly injured, the concept was you fix the patient first, you stabilize the skeleton first, and then the patient will start recovering. So this was a thought process in the 1980s. And so what happened was everyone used to jump on these patients and start fixing them, start nailing them, till the 1990s, when early series of unexpected complications started being described. Now, if you, I'm sure a lot of people, a lot of you must have seen what a K-nail looks like. So K-nail was described or is existing, since probably internal fixation of orthopedics began. But even in the early reports of K-nail, it has been described that this leads to a lot of inflammatory response even when you're open nailing a fracture. And this was sort of probably forgotten between the 1950s to the 1980s. And in the 1990s, when the unexpected complications started being described, then people started thinking that whether fixing all of them early is appropriate. So what were these early complications? These early complications very commonly were unexpectedly high rate of pulmonary complications. And then they thought that the method of stabilization and the timing of stabilization may have a role. Now this, we are coming to Europe. So the Americans thought that operating on everyone early was the standard of care. The Europeans started flagging up that early total care was not appropriate for all the multiply injured patients. And this is where the trauma world started having differences of opinion. And therefore they started thinking that it is not suitable for all, but in whom is it suitable, and more importantly, in whom is it not suitable. And this led to the definition of the borderline patient. So if the patient has multiple injuries with the injury severity score of more than 20 with an additional thoracic trauma, then which leads to an abbreviated injury severity score of more than 2, or the patient has multiple injuries along with the abdominal or a pelvic trauma with shock, or the patient has evidence of bilateral pulmonary contusions, or the initial pulmonary arterial pressure is more than this 24 millimeters of mercury, or and it is important because it increases during the IM kneeling. Now let's think as orthopedic surgeons. Among from this slide, the most important things that you can take home is, yes, multiple injuries, second is thoracic trauma, and third is abdominal or pelvic trauma with shock. Okay, so if you have a X-ray chest or a CT scan, which is very easily done in all good trauma centers, that shows evidence of pulmonary contusion, remember it's bad news. If you have a fracture along with either a abdominal trauma or a thoracic trauma, again it's a polytrauma or it's bad news. So just be on the lookout from this slide. Be on the forget the scores, forget the arterial pressures, because I mean we don't do it. None of us do it in the first go. So if you realize that these two injuries are there, then it fits a particular pattern, and this could be the borderline patient that we are talking about. So this is where in these patients, the damage control orthopedics, this concept was floated. So what is the damage control orthopedics? It is basically we know the advantage of fixing them early. So provisionally fix these fractures. So it allows and gives us time to improve the patient's physiology. You provide stability to the fracture with minimal soft tissue damage. So don't go on doing extensive surgeries, cause little surgical bleeding. So remember that the patient is in shock. The patient is in shock because of the initial trauma. If we operate on him and subject him to another trauma, there will be more bleeding. So minimal invasion, minimal soft tissue handling and damage, little surgical bleeding, and therefore you basically avoid the second hit. So the first hit was the trauma, and the second hit is the major orthopedic procedure. So we avoid that until the patient is adequately resuscitated. So this damage control orthopedics, for those who don't know, is the concept which is borrowed from US Navy. So if you see the ships which are hit by either missiles or torpedo or because of some damage, what tends to happen is basically the whole ship can start sinking. But the ships are designed in such a way that if the water starts logging, then it is just compartmentalized. So what they have devised the ships in a particular way that only the certain section would be sort of written off or would be sort of cordoned off, and the rest of the ship can be salvaged. Secondly, this was also done by the general surgeons in the army and in the navy for penetrating abdominal trauma. That that the hit has happened. Let us not do a very detailed surgery, but let us work towards salvaging this patient and resuscitating this patient. So the whole idea is to minimize the second hit. So now let's see in a very simple graphical format what happens. So you can see that there is systemic inflammation. The yellow line on the top indicates the critical amount of systemic inflammation which the body can handle. So immediately after the trauma, there is a spurt or there is a rise in the systemic inflammation, and with time this sort of dies off or is tapers off. If you add the second incident, which is the surgery, or you opt for an early definitive care, then the inflammation is more than what the body can handle. The patient can land up with multi-organ dysfunction or systemic inflammatory response, pulmonary edema, and all sorts of complications, and you may lose the patient. And therefore, and if you do a delayed definitive care, the systemic response is much lesser and much more safer. So that is where the damage control comes in. So there is this acute trauma, and after that you do a damage control, you give us sort of a second hit which is much easier for the body to handle. So basically damage control orthopedics, it minimizes the inflammation to prevent it, and which is much lesser than the threshold for SIRS and organ failure. So this is a paper which has come from Europe, and this is a good trauma center at Hanover where Hans Christoph Pape, who has also described the Pape's classification for open injuries and management of open injuries, along with Peter Giannudis. So Giannudis is from Leeds, again a very big trauma center, and Christian Kretek. Now I'm not sure where Kretek is from, but these three authors, they came together, and this is a very good article in Journal of Orthopedic Trauma. It talks about timing of fixation in major fractures and where we can use simple indicators to make a clinical decision. Now, this is a very busy slide, so I'll just underline a few salient points. So what we are interested in, there are four class of patient. Let's say there is a stable patient, there is unstable patient, and a patient who is in extremis. So in these, there is no controversy. So we know a stable patient is a patient who does not have shock, whose systolic blood pressure is more than 100, who has lost blood, but who in about 2 units of blood transfusion can sort of reverse everything back. There are these values like lactate levels, the base deficit, platelet counts, which we all have access to, and the temperature of the patient. So the borderline patient is one who's not maintaining a systolic blood pressure. So the unstable patient, again, there is no sort of controversy in managing these patients. So we all know we would manage the unstable patient in a way that we will put a fixator, or we would sort of do a provisional fixation, resuscitate him, and then do the delayed surgery later on. It is a borderline patient in whom we are interested because these patients can sort of deteriorate later on. So these are the parameters. The patient's blood pressure would be around, the systolic BP would be between 80 to 100, and he would have lost between 2 units, and he probably would require another 3 or 4 units more blood to sort of resuscitate, and the lactate levels. Now, if you have to remember something from this talk today, remember that if a lactate level is less than 2.5, it is good news for the orthopedic surgeon. And now, where do you find these lactate levels? All the patients with polytrauma get an ABG. So if you look at an ABG, in our hospital, we require to request for an extra lactate. So we always say get an ABG with lactates. In the bottom line, it is written where what the lactates are. You see the amount of lactates. If it is 4, 5, it is definitely bad news. Patient is in acidosis, and it just tells you that the patient is not resuscitated well. So if the patient's lactates are less than 2, then it is very good that the patient is resuscitated well, and you can very well proceed with a definitive fixation. The base deficit, again, it is there in the ABG. You need to just look at the ABG. But what we are used to looking is platelet counts. So platelet counts is there in the CBC. You would get a hemoglobin. More than hemoglobin, also pay attention to the platelet count. If the patient is having low platelet count, then again, it's a problem. It is a sort of a harbinger of bad news. We don't routinely get a fibrinogen done. We don't routinely get a D-dimer done because it is going to be elevated. But also look at the patient's temperature. The temperature, if the patient is in hypothermia, if the patient is shivering, so you know that the patient is heading towards the shock or patient is in the shock. So therefore, definitely warm the patient. So this triad of hypothermia, coagulopathy, and acidosis is definitely bad news, and it can we know from our biochemistry that patient will have some coagulopathy if all these three things are there. Now coming to the bottom line, the lung function. So the lung function is the PO to FiO2 ratio. Now, where would you get this PO to FiO2 ratio? If the patient is in the ICU, just ask the intensivist what is the patient's PO to FiO2 ratio. The PO2 is the partial pressure of oxygen. The FiO2 is a fraction or the proportion of the inspired oxygen. Now, from COVID, I think after COVID, everyone knows what a PO to FiO2 ratio is and what is a patient maintaining this thing as. So if the PO to FiO2 ratio is more than 350, then it is again good news that even if the patient has some lung problems, he is resuscitated well, the lungs have recovered. If it's less than 300, then it's definitely bad news. It tells you that the patient has got either pulmonary contusion or he has got an acute lung injury. Now, what is the problem with an acute lung injury? The problem with the acute lung injury is that if it is combined with any long bone injury, either a pelvic injury or a long bone injury like the fracture of shaft femur or the tibia, it can lead to microemboli, it can lead to fat emboli, and the patient can worsen. So these are the patients that you need to watch out for. So only 4 values from this particular page is that if the patient's lactate levels are in normal range, then the patient is stable. If it is more than 2.5, then you offer the patient damage control orthopedics. If the patient's sort of platelet counts are low, lactate levels are very high, the temperature is low, and the PO to FiO2 ratio is less than 300, then definitely the patient has to go for damage control orthopedics. So, as I said, persistent hemodynamic instability, metabolic acidosis, which is reflected by your base excess, which you can find in the ABG, or the lactate levels, which you can again find in the ABG. And if it's combined with a severe head or chest injury, this definitely means that you will go for damage control orthopedics. Now, there is something else that has come in the new ATLS manuals, which you should know for either your exams and even practical life also. There's a concept of permissive hypotension. In the earlier ATLS manuals, it was said that you resuscitate the patient to sort of a good systolic blood pressure, more than 100. But now they say that keep the patient's systolic blood pressure low, lesser than 90 millimeters of mercury. It is called as permissive hypotension for a simple. So don't let it go down below 70 and 8 and 60 and all, but basically don't resuscitate it to a level where it can dislodge the clots in the pelvic fractures. So this especially came true of pelvic fractures that a clot is formed, and if the systolic blood pressure is raised by giving some medicines like adrenaline, noradrenaline, or let's say even by giving a lot of fluids, it can dislodge the clots and cause secondary bleeding. So therefore, this concept of permissive hypotension to have adequate perfusion of the sort of the solid organs. The other concept was hemostatic resuscitation. That means if the patient has lost blood, you replace that with blood. So we are not depending on IV fluids for resuscitation. If the patient has lost blood, you replace that with blood products. So one is permissive hypotension, second is hemostatic resuscitation. Now, under hemostatic resuscitation, basically, tranexamic acid is a very commonly used drug now in your knee replacements and hip replacements in pelvic fractures. This has become a standard of care. So it has appeared in ATLS manuals. It has appeared in all the resuscitation manuals, ACLS and PALS, that tranexamic acid in shock can be given. So the dose is 1 gram in the first 10 minutes and then give 1 gram over the next 8 hours. So quite similar to what you would give for your knee and hip replacements. But yes, instead of 500 milligrams, you give 1 gram and 1 gram. Every big hospital will have some blood transfusion protocols. There will be some set points, like if the hemoglobin is less than 8.5, you transfuse. In shock, if the patient's hemoglobin is less than 7.5, how much you're going to transfuse, when you're going to do a hemoglobin again. So you should have good blood transfusion protocols. This will be set in by your intensivist or the pathologist also. Now, in centers which are really advanced, where they are doing a lot of sort of transplants, they would also have something called as TEG. For those who don't know, TEG stands for thromboelastograph. So, I mean, this can also come as a short note. So, the thromboelastograph is basically taken from arterial blood, and the beauty of TEG is that it tells you exactly which part of the clotting cycle is affected and what you need to replace with what. It will tell you when sort of you need to have FFPs, when you need to have platelets, when whole blood, and when any clotting factor is required. So, to tell you honestly, we ask for TEG. It is done by the anesthesia technician, and the TEG machine has to be brought. It's a very small machine. It has to be brought next to the patient, because it has to be processed immediately. That is one. And secondly, it is done by the anesthetist. They can read a TEG, especially if they are doing any transplants. To tell you honestly, I cannot read a TEG graph, but I would sort of rely on my intensivist or the anesthetist to tell me the answer. Now, how often do we use that? We use that because we have it. But does it mean that it is mandatory? No, it is not really mandatory. If you remember the permissive hypotension, hemostatic resuscitation, tranexamic acid, that should be sufficient. And then you proceed with the damage control surgery. So to recap everything, so the patient is in extremis or is really unstable, then you do a temporary external fixator, you decompress the hematomas which is there. If there is a acute bleeding from somewhere, you stop the bleeding, shift the patient to the ICU and hand him over to the intensivist. So the last person the patient requires, if he is polytraumatized and is unstable, is an orthopedic surgeon. He basically needs an anesthetist or an intensivist to correct all the parameters to resuscitate him well. And in the stage 3, when the parameters are corrected, when the values are all normal, then you consider the patient for definitive stabilization, which can even take between 4 to 7 days or sometimes even longer. But till then, you're not worried because you have provisionally fixed these fractures. So what are the endpoints of your resuscitation? When do we want to go in with a definitive surgery like a plating or intramedullary nailing, or you want to fix your tibial plateau fractures? So any surgery taking more than 2 hours or more than that. So the endpoints of the resuscitation we should know as orthopedic surgeon is that when the hemodynamics are stable, when the patient is not requiring any adrenaline, noradrenaline, or vasopressors. So this you can easily find out from the drug charts. When the oxygen saturation is good, when the PaO to FiO2 ratio is more than 300, the lactate levels is less than 2. So if you just remember these few values, this will help you through planning any surgery that you would want to in a polytraumatized patient. No coagulation disturbance, the patient is normothermic, and the urine output is more than 1 ml per hour, 1 ml per kg per hour. So more than about whatever 30 to 50 ml per hour. And the patient does not require any inotropic support, as I mentioned. So let us look at some time frames. Now, let's say if the patient presented to you on day first, when do you expect certain normalization, and when what happens when the patient does not normalize? So to take you through the graph, let's go to the first one. If the patient has presented in a shock, his BP is less than 90 millimeters of mercury systolic, so it will usually it should take less than 1 day for patient to stabilize. But if you look at the third column, if the patient after day 2 also requires adrenaline, noradrenaline, or any vasopressors, then he's definitely in a high risk category. The lactates, if they are more than 2.5, he should be resuscitated well. The acidosis, the base excess should be corrected within the first day. But if it is not corrected within the first day, then again it is a problem. It indicates that the patient is persistently acidotic and he is not stable for you to do any orthopedic surgery. So this is again when you consider a damage control orthopedics. So going through the coagulation, the patient's temperature, again they all stabilize within the first day or a few hours. But the lung contusions, they take an awfully long time. They will take about 2 to 4 days for them to settle. So if you are planning to do the surgery the next day or the day after, then you would want to look at the PO to FI ratio, look at the patient saturation, and then plan whenever you want to do the surgery. So this particular graph or this screenshot is quite important. Again, it is from the same article, and it's a very good article because it talks in an orthopedic language. It doesn't talk in an intensive care or doesn't talk in a sort of physician's language. It is a very simple language that we can understand. So when do I do a definitive fixation? As I mentioned in the previous slide, lactates are normal. The base excess is corrected. Again, you'll find the base excess on the ABG. So you don't need to go anywhere, do any calculations. ABG will tell you the base excess when the coagulation parameters are corrected and the lung functions are corrected. So to illustrate a few examples, I'll just go through a few examples. Now, this is a gentleman who's, let's say, about 55. He was drunk, driving, asleep at the wheel, had a very bad head injury. You can see that bilateral mandibles are fractured, maxillofacial injury. He had got a diffuse axonal injury, head trauma, and this is what he came with: bilateral fracture shaft femurs, bilateral tibial plateau fractures, and the left humerus, proximal humerus fracture. And he also had got little metacarpal fractures, which we would ignore at the same time. So this would be an ideal indication for a damage control orthopedics, because more than two long bone injuries, a head injury, which you don't know which way it is going to behave because it's a diffuse axonal injury, and a sort of possible lung injury. So we offered him damage control. So on the first day, we put in an external fixator and we handed him over to the ICU people. So this is the X-ray on admission. So you can see that the lungs are fairly okay. And on the next day, in spite of doing a damage control, you can see some shadows appearing. The patient's PO to FiO2 ratio is still worsening. Ground glass opacity is bilaterally. This is a full-blown ARDS. So if we would have nailed him or done an early sort of total care for him, we would definitely have been in big problems. So in spite of doing a damage control, this patient still went through the whole routine of developing full-blown ARDS. Because we had put in an external fixator, we could buy some time. We could let his lungs reverse, let all the parameters correct. And when everything was corrected, we decided to do a definitive fixation of all the lower bone injuries at the same go. So he had a retrograde IM nail on the right side, a tibial plateau fracture fixation, and then he had a biological plating on the left side. So this was not difficult because we had already had a fixator in place, and so the soft tissues were taken care of, the lungs were now settled. So without any fear, you could go in and fix this particular fracture. The second case is, it's a bad sort of a pelvic injury along with bilateral distal, he had a distal femur fracture on one side and a shaft femur on the other side. Bilateral low sort of forearm injuries, distal and radius fracture with disruption of the distal radial ulnar joint. So on the first day, a supraacetabular pin bilaterally to sort of just stabilize the pelvis. Now here, yes, we could have put a posterior SI joint fixator pin or a screw, but you can see that, you know, in the heat of the moment, unstable patient, all we could do is we could just quickly put these pins, put the external fixator. And once the patient was stable, we planned for a definitive fixation, where fixation of the pelvis was taken in one sitting. At the next sitting, we fix the femoral fractures and the hand fractures. So you get enough time to space out your treatment, so every fracture can be sorted out adequately and more appropriately. Third case, again, bilateral femoral fractures. He didn't have anything else. So again, nailing of bilateral femoral fractures is bad news, because the insult to the chest due to the the marrow or the fatty marrow is quite severe. So therefore, when you are planning for a bilateral nailing, honestly speaking, in the last 8 years or so, I've never done a bilateral nailing at a single sitting. It always has been one-sided fixator, one side nailing, and the other side is planned at a later date. So I may be a bit conservative in this approach, but it is definitely a safer approach to do rather than subject to the patient to a bilateral intramedullary nailing at the same sitting. So this patient had bilateral sort of femoral fixation, but one side, on the right side, we did a plating, extramedullary fixation, and the left side was an intramedullary fixation, and the hands and the legs were wired later on. This is a ipsilateral segmental femoral fracture with a tibia. Again, these are all bad news because there are very high velocity injuries with a lot of soft tissue trauma. The soft tissue trauma itself lends itself to, sort of myoglobin release, maybe
सर कौन है वो
myoglobin.
दिमाग वाला सड़क पे लगा है?
And the other problem is of fat embolism. So the fat embolism is a problem in these patients along with the risk of bleeding. So initially, a Thomas splint when he comes to the casualty, but then as soon as possible put him in a fixator, and then doing a definitive fixation at a second stage. So to summarize, early definitive fixation is safe in only stable patients, and we have seen the definition of stable patient. For rest, all of the patients, damage control is a much safer option. Yes, it causes sort of, the patient is with you for a longer time. The patient, your definitive treatment has been delayed for a few days, but it's definitely a much more safer option than subjecting the patients to all the problems that he will face in the ICU and the threat to his life in case the inflammatory response is very severe. The conversion to the definitive fixation should be after all the hemodynamic parameters. And in this case, in today's talk, and for the sake of your exams, for the sake of your practice, just look at the lactates, the PO to FiO2 ratio, and wait for the coagulation and the base excess to stabilize. And once that is done, then you can safely sort of plan your definitive fixation at ease. Thank you very much.